Follow at the National Center for Public Policy Research. And I want to thank the FDA for holding this meeting. The National Center for Public Policy Research, in terms of disclosure, receives approximately 99% of our funding from individuals around the country, including many smokers who are trying to quit. We also receive funding from pharmaceutical companies who would stand to be hurt by harm reduction, and cigarette companies that would stand to be hurt by harm reduction, as well as some smokeless tobacco sources. I praise the FDA for holding this meeting because this is a special time that we're actually having a conversation that I think and I hope is about the notion of tobacco harm reduction. I wrote a piece for the Guardian newspaper just last week praising the FDA compared to the EU, where they're not even engaging in this process. And I have some concerns about some of the things that were said this morning and the way that some of the questions are being phrased, which I'll address in my comments. But the very fact that this meeting is being held, as Scott Balin said this morning, is a huge step forward. And while I may have some criticism and others may have some criticisms, those of us that support harm reduction, I think are appreciative of the fact that the FDA is holding science-based, transparent meetings in an effort to actually have a policy that will go forward to improve public health. And comparing it globally, I think we're moving in the right direction. And those are the nice things I have to say. I appreciate the opportunity to speak towards the end, especially after some of the earlier panelists, especially with what Scott Balin said, which is just so important in terms of having this open dialogue. It's rare to hear applause. We heard him after Bill Godshall's talk. And I'm glad to go after Bill because not only do I endorse what he said, but I think it's a good opportunity for the backdrop. Dr. Shields said earlier that this framework is not public policy, and I would respectfully disagree, or at least question whether or not this framework is public policy or not. Because the questions that are asked, the types of questions that are asked, will influence public policy, appropriately so. So let's not act like this is not public policy. This is a part of the public policy process. The science appropriately is playing a role in that. And therefore, the types of questions that we ask here and the answers that we get are appropriately part of the public policy approach. I'm not going to use my full 7 minutes, okay? I want to make a very clear point here. The questions that we ask are public policy. And the questions are really one of two things. Is our goal here to, as we heard this morning, to reduce and eliminate tobacco use, which I think some people are calling for, or is it to reduce and eliminate the health effects of tobacco? And that is the critical question. Are we here to reduce tobacco use, or are we here to reduce the health effects of tobacco use? Very different questions, very different answers in terms of public policy. How many smokers will continue to smoke as the FDA explores and tackles these questions? Smokers are dying every day. New smokers are coming on board. Is it really so complex that some of the earlier presentations made it look complex, and it is complex. Scientists and policymakers are good at making things complex, and I think it will get more complex. But at the end of the day, as Bill Godshall pointed out, the fact that smokeless tobacco is less harmful than cigarettes, smokeless tobacco is less harmful than cigarettes, is a very simple concept. And we can make it complex, but people will continue to die as we do that. And there are those in public policy, advocates, anti-tobacco advocates, who seek to withhold scientific information from the public. And in doing so, we always have to be aware of the unintended consequences of public policy, that people will continue to die so long as we don't offer alternatives. And we can make this as complex as we want, but the bottom line is two questions. Are we here to reduce tobacco use, or are we here to reduce the health effects of tobacco use? And that's, I think, the question before you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stier. And our 13th speaker is Elaine Keller with the Consumer Advocates for Smoke-Free Alternatives Association.
Lucky number 13, huh? My name is Elaine Keller. I'm Vice President for the Consumer Advocates for Smoke-Free Alternatives Association. I have no conflicts of interest. I'm here representing the interests of consumers. My work experience
center button, but it takes a second.
I need some help.
Oh, there it goes.
There, okay, thank you. To develop the best solution, you must ask the right questions, include all stakeholders, agree on the evidence, and most important, agree on the purpose for building the solution. Let's take these in reverse order. What is our common goal? At last month's TIPSAC meeting, one of the speakers stated, the purpose of this law was to draw a line in the sand and say, no new products. Not true. The law does not prevent less harmful products. Rather, it specifically allows for them in Section 911 and calls for effective oversight. It also requires that consumers receive complete and truthful information. From a consumer viewpoint, I would say the most important purpose is to reduce smoking-related diseases and deaths. Forget profits, prejudices, and politics. Lives are at stake. Oops. Okay, we're one past, but I'll just talk about it. Do we agree on the evidence? All tobacco products clearly are not equally harmful. Concealing the truth about less hazardous alternatives endangers the health and lives of smokers. Including consumers in this process would add real-world practical experience to your body of scientific knowledge. Tobacco and nicotine consumers have much more at stake than any of the other stakeholders, yet they have not been given a seat at the table. Frankly, when I saw the list of questions the FDA wanted addressed, I was shocked. If every potential modified risk product has to produce scientific evidence to address each of those questions, plus the various subparts, it will be 100 years before we start saving any lives. It also appears that some of the questions reflect underlying assumptions that are not true. FDA asks what scientific evidence would prove that allowing the MRTP to be marketed would not decrease or delay cessation. Wasting time trying to answer this unanswerable question will result in more lost lives. Complete switching to a smoke-free product doesn't delay or decrease cessation. Complete switching is cessation, smoking cessation. An underlying assumption is that all smokers will quit using nicotine in the near future. This assumption is demonstrably false. Some smokers may never be able to live productive lives without nicotine, especially those who are self-medicating underlying conditions that impair their cognitive and or emotional health. Tobacco harm reduction would save these lives. A second faulty assumption is that the healthiest course for all tobacco users is to become totally abstinent. Define healthy. Dr. John Hughes states that many adolescents began smoking as a multi-purpose pharmacological coping strategy. Becoming nicotine abstinent allows the underlying pathology to reemerge. What we have been labeling as withdrawal may actually be a return to an unhealthy baseline for a substantial portion of smokers. Piasecki et al. Examined data from clinical trials to evaluate the time course and severity of withdrawal symptoms. They found two patterns that did not fit the typical profile. Only 32% showed a steady decline in symptom severity. Clusters 2 and 3 that you see up top showed an initial decline followed by a return to the quit-day severity of symptoms. Not surprisingly, smoking cessation rates were significantly lower for clusters 2 and 3. Smokers are told they'll feel much better after a few weeks of abstinence, but 68% of smokers in this study stayed distressed and dysfunctional through 8 weeks of treatment. Once treatment ends, things don't get better. They'll get much, much worse. If you believe that cognitive and emotional health are just as important as physical health, nicotine abstinence may not be the healthiest course for a majority of those who are still smokers today. and that dual users have higher health risks. The evidence shows both these assumptions are false. The evidence shows that dual use decreases health risks because less smoke enters the body. I can tell you from experience that many smokers, if not most, go through a period of dual use on their way to smoking cessation. I know there are people who wish to believe smoke-free alternatives don't improve cessation, but the facts say otherwise. At last month's TIPSAC meeting, one of the speakers stated that one death is one death too many. Well, we have over 400,000 people dying of smoking-related diseases each year. We have people dying from using approved cessation methods and quite possibly dying from accidents, crimes, or suicides triggered by nicotine abstinence impairments. If the FDA decides to make the MRTP approval process cumbersome, expensive, and time-consuming, many more smokers will sicken and die quite unnecessarily. All the less hazardous products in the world won't save any lives if the public doesn't know they exist. 4 months after I stopped smoking, the FDA made an announcement calculated to make me believe that the product I was using would be more likely to give me cancer or to poison me than cigarette smoking. If the Washington Times had not published the truth, I might have relaxed to smoking and been smoking for the past 2 years. Many people who were considering switching decided to continue inhaling smoke instead. Was this in the best interest of public health? Not their health. The press continually repeats this disinformation because it remains uncorrected on the FDA website. Isn't it time to start providing the public with the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I leave you with these words of wisdom from Voltaire. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the